Hello, and welcome to Getting the Security and Flexibility Balance Right in a COVID-19 World. If you're joining us live, our speaker is in the Slido chat discussion answering your questions right now. She'll also be participating in a live Ask the Expert roundtable on this topic right after this session. For audio-video issues, you can click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Magda Shelley for the presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending my talk today. I will be discussing getting the security and flexibility balance right in a COVID-19 world where things are changing and disrupting the way that security is perceived and processed and implemented. So let me give you a little bit more insights about my experiences nowadays working with various companies across the world and in particular in Asia Pacific. But before that, let me give you a little bit more perspective about myself. So I am a telecommunication engineer with a specialization in cybersecurity and have been working as a chief information security officer for, like I mentioned, a variety of companies across different industries. What I have as well noticed is that different perspectives bring different questions, and therefore, please do not hesitate to ask me any questions like Casey mentioned. You probably see and read nowadays a variety of news about cybersecurity. And one of the main areas or approach coming back from the general public or your business stakeholders is that they might not understand what exactly is happening for their business nowadays and how they can tackle those particular new emerging risks, knowing that they are not in our field or they are not cybersecurity professionals. Within those questions might arise very simple ones, like are the cyber attacks increasing during COVID-19 pandemic? Or what are the changes that my company will actually be faced to or faced towards within this, again, pandemic, knowing that I needed to shift in a digital transformation very quickly. As part of Asia Pacific, where I am familiar with in terms of region, I noticed that the digital transformation that have been adopted by companies is very much related to a sense of speed. We need to go and allow the productivity to continue for our employees. And very often that digital transformation is not driven by, let's say, the regulatory requirement or eventually by the cybersecurity team involved from the beginning of the project. Therefore, in particular, within a certain, I would say, environment like nowadays with the COVID-19, we see that need into going in that transformation very quickly and unknowingly raising new emergent risks. And as part of that, I'm sure you're aware, cybersecurity professionals, with the emerging and increasing cyber attacks. And as usual, the weakest link is the human factor. And with additional COVID-19 themed phishing attacks, malware-based attacks, and even fake social media, as well as phishing attacks, we see that our enterprise attack vectors are increasing, and we do not have eventually that much control over, especially when we are talking, for example, about phishing attacks. And here, I would actually add one point that I consider extremely important when I discuss this with chief information security officers as well from other organizations. We have seen new policies mentioning that, passwords should not rotate, for example, or that we change the way that we literally have our policies nowadays. But if your employees are working from home and eventually working from their own devices, they are using those devices to perform business activities. And eventually, even if you have endpoint management in place, you might still be exposed to different risk scenarios. And as such, one of those scenarios is an employee always using the same password, using the password with them, their social media accounts, and the same password with their corporate accounts. And you don't have control over that because the employee has the freedom to do that and using especially their own devices. So this is an example of scenarios that definitely is increasing within the COVID-19 pandemic. But as such, again, I think there is a certain level of perception from the security professionals that you have control because you have implemented certain controls over people, process, and technology that you reduce your risk. You have your proper comfort zone, which you have been operating with, and you believe that that might still work even if your employees are working remotely. Well, yes, in a particular case. But let's again go back to the fact that your employees are working from anywhere towards insecure networks, or even just working from a different environment that they will or have been used to. As an example, quarantine in hotels or quarantine in other environments besides or in addition of their own houses. What they will do, as a very simple example, is that they will use their email to communicate with businesses, to communicate with different stakeholders, including eventually clients. And as one other risk scenario, and I would say different scenarios that happens, is that if the employee is facing any technical challenges by communicating through the corporate email, they will use their personal email. And this is, again, something that realistically happens. Comparing to our comfort zone where we think we have our very good controls in place across our environment within the corporate environment, we actually are not seeing or not addressing those new emerging risks that, again, within the COVID-19 are increasing and growing. What happens if your employees nowadays are sending emails not only with confidential information, but to your customers using their personal emails? And within this slide that you see on the screen, I'm just bringing a very simple example of a COVID-19 themed attack. And if you want to raise awareness within your employees, which is, again, a risk that is increasing nowadays with the COVID-19, a simple newsletter bringing that example will not be enough because of the example that I gave you. They might use additional channel of communication in order to overcome any technical difficulties, as such latency in accessing the corporate resources, or eventually just the fact that they are using a different laptop or newly joined your organization and they do not have access to the corporate email. Having a perception of perfection or thinking that you have a control over your corporate environment nowadays is not any more effective. And when I mention the effectiveness or some example of scenarios, I would like you to think as a cybersecurity professional of the different perspective of business stakeholders. Because at the end, even if we as security professionals, we would like to address all the cyber risks properly and address those risks come, of course, by either treating them or transferring them or accepting them, we actually need to understand that it still resides within the business stakeholders as business decision makers to take the right decision. And usually their perspective or their questions are different. Their questions might be related to eventually how are the exposures, but not exposures with them, okay, they are new technical risks, but they would like to associate financial loss to any new emerging risks and what that might mean to their own business. And the reality is that we as cybersecurity professionals, we still do not know how to address that problem. So if our environment is changing and our corporate boundaries are not anymore present, like we have seen previously, we are not able to adapt to that as quickly as the business change with the digital transformation, including something that is very new for especially cybersecurity professionals, which is risk quantification. And I will try to bring that as a very important key process on how to ensure that your business stakeholders are able to address the new emerging risks within the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially post-COVID-19 pandemic, because we will see a great shift, and you probably as cybersecurity professional know that very well, but how to translate that into business risk and how to ensure that you deliver a continuous cyber risk assessment when it comes to shifting continuously business risk profile, especially with uncertain environment. And when I say uncertain environment, we actually are in a very particular scenario in general for businesses. We're not talking about one, I would say, in a event. We're talking about continuously changing uncertainty within the uncertainty. We are unable to have very clear visibility of when and how the new coming waves of COVID-19 pandemics will affect our work, will affect our environment. And as a cybersecurity professional, this means that we will have waves of employees continuously working from the office, then will be asked to work again remotely, and then again we eventually come back to the office and again come back and work remotely. What that means in particular is that, yeah, you perhaps know and you might think that we have these boundaries, we have the controls that help us enable the corporate controls across our environment, and that should be enough. But I believe that we have still a very big gap, not only from the security perspective with our business stakeholders and how do we present our cyber risks, but as well understanding the gap between us cybersecurity professionals and what the end users are doing and what the end users are expecting, and in particular our employees. Because whatever we implement nowadays, we need to implement it to ensure a certain level of effectiveness. And when we're talking about effectiveness, we're talking about our employees ensuring the right process, our employees being aware of the right security measures that we have in place in our companies, within our organization. And one of the very famous, I would say, model around risk quantification is the FAIR model. And the factor analysis of information risk is the only international standard that helps quantifying the information security and operational risk, which is, again, something that I have very rarely seen implemented by Chief Information Security Officer. So when it comes to ensuring that quantitative model, let me tell you an example of how it can be extremely relevant for you to help the business migrate over an environment that is raising uncertainty. You have your risk register, you have your risk management process nowadays implemented within your organization, and you're addressing those risks in a way, for example, following certain international standards, making sure that you have visibility of maturity, eventually adding a percentage of implementation, and using that as an important way to report to your board, to your business stakeholders, to C-level executives, depending on how you're reporting nowadays. However, again, if the business is within an environment that's changing very quickly, you might want to take a different approach. The quantification of risk might help you bringing up 3 or 5 or even 10 risk scenarios that are extremely important or critical for your business, helping to understand what those scenarios are bringing to the business or how those scenarios are impacting your business, and then clearly describing that impact to your business. So now you're telling me, what are you bringing new, Magda, right? Because we are doing that already. I'm going to show you some examples for the COVID-19 and what factors or what criteria you should be taking in consideration. Again, going back or going out of your comfort zone as a security professional and taking in consideration some business factors, some regulatory requirements, some shifting areas around the risks within the COVID-19, but as well from the compliance perspective and privacy perspective as well. Individuals and organizations are fighting COVID-19. As I mentioned, we will probably have different waves, and that means different shifts across the organizations, not only having that visibility about social distancing that we have in certain countries nowadays across Asia Pacific. We might continuously have different arrangement across working habits. Your employees might face different crisis communications, different travel restrictions, especially if you operate across different countries. That means that your remote working controls nowadays might need to adapt. Again, imagine an environment where your employees are going back at certain times, then going out of the office. You still need to hire new employees. Those employees onboarding might raise new risk and therefore new challenges for you as cybersecurity professionals. Go out of your comfort zone where you have control over your environment, because nowadays with the evolving risks that are changing, you don't have any more that comfort. You are actually in need to build different risk management process, and that risk management process needs to take in consideration uncertainty within the uncertainty. As you have seen this model of, going into different shifts of risks, I would add a different level of, again, things that eventually you are aware of, and we talk about shadow IT, but the shadow IT goes beyond. We are talking about insecure home networks. We are talking about employees working from quarantined entities or environments like hotels. And then here you would tell me, but Magda, we are using virtual private networks. Again, we have a proper controls in place addressing that risk. And well, I will tell you, what will your employees do if your actually VPN will not be allowed within that particular insecure network? Because the reality is that nowadays certain public networks, Wi-Fi networks in particular, with shared environments like hotels or other entities, do not allow VPNs to work. And therefore, again, you might know those kind of scenarios, but the scenarios are shifting. The scenarios that you need to take in consideration will need you as cybersecurity professional to have visibility of the major high and critical risk scenarios, taking into consideration the shifting risk profile of your companies. The risk profiles, as I mentioned, as an example, traditional VPNs not working for your employees to connect, raising a different way of working. Your employees might be exposed to additional network risks or just cyber risks. But that was only one challenge that I want you to think about. The other challenge in this particular region is new privacy laws that include the fact that companies will need to implement additional technology to monitor social distancing regulations or requirements within the regulation. And as such, one really interesting is the fact that in some countries, we might not only have new privacy laws, including data breach regulation, which this is not something that is changing, but we might have, again, laws that need or require to implement CCTV cameras everywhere within your organization's environment. And when we are talking about that, if your organization is implementing new technology, we as cybersecurity professionals, we know that this requires a risk assessment, this requires some controls, and we probably are taking that into already consideration within the traditional boundaries of our business. But if your business nowadays operates in countries where those laws are enacted or enabled very quickly, you might find yourself operating in an environment where your business stakeholders took the decision to implement CCTVs across the business organization without that particular assessment and without knowing of how your cybersecurity controls are efficiently implemented. So here, as you can see, I'm trying to describe a way of how to ensure that you have a visibility of new emerging risks with the current challenging environment. So again, the funny thing about this slide is go out of your comfort zone and try to focus on quantifying the risk across the new scenarios that might relate to uncertainty within the uncertainty and might be 3, 5, 10 new risks within the environment. And those risks are not taking the traditional business perimeter in consideration anymore. We are actually working nowadays without boundaries anymore. So what I'm adding nowadays, again, I'm adding for you a different perspective. Try to ensure that you work very closely with the other teams in collaboration with the privacy team, with your compliance team. I do feel that we as cybersecurity professionals would like that kind of collaboration and ensure that you have a proper communication with your employees in general. As a cybersecurity professional, and especially as a chief information security professional, especially when you are a global reach, ensure that you still are reachable. Because your new emerging scenarios not only will require you to take in consideration this very particular new risk scenarios that you will need to quantify, but as well that you take in consideration reality versus your perfect, assimilation of your control today that you have implemented within a traditional approach to cybersecurity. I mentioned the fact that certain environment might not allow your VPN to work, your VPN might face technical issues and therefore might raise to situations where your employees will use additional channels of communication, including their personal emails, to communicate with clients, to communicate with colleagues. That particular scenarios might raise risks like data loss. And again, please feel free to ask me questions. I'm available live, so do raise some of the challenges that you're facing. I'm more than happy to address them. The other, of course, approach is, or risks that we see, is raising risks with the COVID-19 themed attacks, which you are familiar with. But again, if your employees are using bring your own device, they actually might not have the same controls. You might have facing some additional business interruption because they're just onboarding, they are new. So very important new cyber risk assessment is go out of your comfort zone. Again, I'm repeating myself, but it's very important. Have your top 3, 5, 10 new emerging cyber risk scenarios and then quantify them. Now you tell me, how do we quantify such new emerging risk if you don't have data related to those? Because of course, when we're talking about quantification, we need to take in consideration proper data to ensure that we have a certain modeling. We're not talking about, oh, we will have an attack from a cybersecurity perspective. This is how I see it will impact the business. Approximately, I might impact the business with 10 million of loss if that happens. No, again, try to ensure that you work closely with the privacy team, with the compliance team, and have a visibility of how your business might be interrupted. And when I say interruption, here I forgot to mention that you need to work as well very closely with your IT team. And if you work with your IT team, you eventually might understand a little bit further how long it takes to recover your business if that happens. And if you have clarity about your business or your cyber risk scenarios, then you decide very clearly what are your factors that you will take in consideration to model your business risk quantification, then only then you will be able to very clearly understand the business impact, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially after and post the pandemic, because again, we're not talking about one wave, we're talking about an environment that is going through different waves or uncertainty, and therefore we as cybersecurity professionals, we need to adapt to those waves. And as I am very conscious of time, I don't have more than 30 minutes. I would like you again to focus on data, which is very important nowadays, and human. As cybersecurity professionals, we need to really increase our capabilities within those 2 points. Not any more boundaries or traditional corporate environment, and we need to understand that if we don't communicate with our employees, we are not effective, because they will always find a way to ensure that they work and therefore they perform their business activities even beyond your boundaries, beyond your traditional channels of communication. That's the reality. And I believe we still lack that actually consideration with our risk management process that is taking traditional approach. So my point today for you is, again, ensure data-driven security. Try to focus on the data and the human with a zero trust. In the future, that will be the approach, not anymore taking the traditional boundary, but also a continuous cyber risk assessment. And that continuous cyber risk assessment is not by having a very long risk register with technical scenarios. Let's try to ensure that you have continuously review 3, 5, eventually 10, and 10 I think is already long, risk scenarios that you try to quantify. When you quantify those particular risk scenarios, you take in consideration factors that are important for the business. Privacy regulation or regulatory fines, licenses for your business where you work very closely with different departments, business interruptions when you work with your IT, and have visibility of how long they will take to actually recover from certain business interruptions. So you have visibility. And of course, that visibility not only closes the gap with the reality of your employees working differently, but as well helps you to communicate with your business stakeholders, being realistic and bringing some dollars to your cyber risk scenarios rather than just approximative data that is related to, oh, I think we have seen this data breach or the cyber attack will lead in our industry to a particular loss. No, if you take in consideration something that is realistic for your business, it will speak to your business stakeholder and they will understand. They will understand that the employees will find ways to work differently where you as a business need to take in consideration different factors, and that might lead to a certain level of, again, losses in dollars to the business. So as a new approach, again, taking a data-centric approach is extremely important. Improving authentication and communication with the users, no matter what you actually have in place. Remember, your end users might be your cyber champions. To remember that education and training is very important. Having something that is just sent over newsletters every week, every quarter is absolutely inefficient. I have worked with organizations where the employees didn't even know that there was a chief information security or a security department because of that. Make sure that you are reachable. How? By first, next week, identifying your new emerging risks and making sure that you have the right controls for those emerging risks that are beyond your traditional way of doing cybersecurity. They do not have any more perimeter. They're raising realistic risks compared to whatever you thought was previously. In the next 3 months, ensure that your approach is taking into consideration a non-perimeter-based security. As well, with not only a data-driven, as I mentioned, and those are big concepts, but practical approach. Focus, for example, on a data loss prevention strategy rather than just ensuring some tools for a VPN connectivity, because eventually, as I mentioned, if your organization is working within countries where your employees are working from quarantined environments, they might eventually face technical issues. So how do you ensure that you address those? But again, here, ensure that you talk or discuss with your employees in a way that they understand and in a way that they feel you are reachable. And then within the next 6 months, have a cybersecurity strategy that takes in consideration, again, data and human. Humans are the weakest link, but we don't change it. We keep on talking about it without really taking the actions. And actions are two in particular. Have a simple communication, come back to fundamentals, even by explaining very, very, very essential things. And two, talk with the employees as cybersecurity professionals. Because if they don't feel they can reach you, nothing will change. It's a cultural change. And that's where I would like you to remember. So thank you very much. I'm conscious about time. I hope you learned something that is very valuable for you today. Please reach out with questions. I'm happy to answer. And again, one last point, go out of your comfort zone, because we're changing. We're not anymore within our perimeter or our traditional environment. Thank you again. This was Magda Shelley from Singapore.